Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've all had a chance to grab some food and a drink to sit down. We'll sort of start today's events. Firstly, good afternoon. Welcome to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. ITIF is a non-profit, non-partisan think tank that's involved in have avoided the classic forms of protectionism, tariffs and quotas, and reverted to non-tariff barriers, such as those involved in localization measures. This is partly because there are already well-established constraints on the use of such traditional forms of protectionism, while there are sort of weaker rules, surveillance and enforcement on localization measures. The central aim of these types of measures, especially since the global financial crisis, is to accelerate growth by increasing exports and or decreasing imports. These countries use these policies as a misguided shortcut instead of conducting the harder, sort of broad-based, non-discriminatory type policies that boost innovation and productivity. These measures are also a key part of what we here at ITIF call innovation mercantilism, that countries use to basically give their local companies an unfair and preferential advantage at the expense of foreign firms. Mixed into this are countries that use privacy, cybersecurity, and national security concerns as a cover for digital protectionism measures. And we especially see this in the IT and in regards to data flows. According to the World Trade Organization, these types of non-tariff barriers are twice as trade distorting as tariffs. At the global level, localization barriers distort global trade and investment patterns and reduce global innovation which suffers from excess competition as firms don't receive the returns from the R&D through weak, ineffectual intellectual property protections, and through a balkanization of the global economy and the effect that has on economies of scale. And this poses particular threats to innovation in innovative sectors because the three key characteristics of these sectors are the need for constant innovation, the high fixed costs relative to marginal costs, and the reliance on intellectual property. So for foreign companies operating in the global economy like they are now, facing a growing range of these types of measures, they face a stark choice, often between giving up the technology which is at the heart of their competitive advantage or losing access to some of the fastest growing markets in the world. It's also about the potential for introducing inefficient components into global operations and the effects that has on their competitive position. To use a phrase from The Godfather, these countries are often making multinational companies an offer they can't refuse. So, in the face of slowing global trade and economic growth, there's a concern that countries will become even more tempted to resort to these types of beggar thy neighbour localisation policies. On this positive note, it's my pleasure to introduce our experienced panel of speakers today.
Positive.
Yeah, positive. Firstly, speaking about the life sciences sector, we have Professor Mir Pugash, who is Intellectual Property and Knowledge Management Professor at Maastricht University and founder of Pugash Consilium, a consultancy firm. Mir specialises in intellectual property policy, technology transfer, the economics of the pharmaceutical sector, and the political economy of public health sector. Mir recently took a very interesting and detailed look into localisation barriers in the life sciences sector in his report, Separating Fact from Fiction, How Localisation Barriers Fail, Where Positive Non-Discriminatory Incentives Succeed. After him, we'll have to speak about the renewable energy sector. We have Jonas Nam, Assistant Professor of Energy, Resources and Environment from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies. Prior to joining SAIS, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs at Brown University, and his research focuses on the political economy of innovation and production, with a particular focus on the United States, China and Germany. Thirdly, to speak about the manufacturing sector, we have Ryan Ong, Director International Business Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. Ryan's focus is on the efforts to improve the competitiveness of US manufacturers by looking at eliminating trade barriers overseas, with a particular focus on India and China. Immediately prior to NAM, Ryan held a number of positions in the public and academic sector, including at Duke University and the State Department. And immediately before joining NAM, he worked for 6 years with the US-China Business Council. And then finally, to speak about the IT and digital space, we have David Weller, Head of Global Trade Policy at Google. Prior to joining Google, he was a partner of Wilmer Hale, where he focused on tech-related market access issues, WTO disputes, and other trade policy issues. Prior to that, David served as Deputy Assistant USTR for China and USTR Assistant General Counsel. He was USTR's Chief Legal Advisor on China trade issues and Chief Lawyer for negotiations of free trade agreements with Morocco and Bahrain. With that, I'd like to invite Mir to start things off.
Made a very smart and strategic decision about the audience of the speakers. They put first the old academic, and then they go to the cool Google guy. So, it's sort of like place a rhythm into the discussion. How do I? So, with this very long title, I'll try to make it a very good presentation. To some extent, the audience, you are not the audience, no insults, you are not the audience we should speak to, because the localization policies are taking place usually in the emerging economies. So the issue here is how you convey messages to the emerging economies, to policymakers, about the damage that these policies may create over the longer term. However, I think that one of the most important aspects, even in speaking about these aspects in DC, is that the issue of localization is still to some extent an emerging concept. There are two main challenges in my view in terms of my research over the years and my colleagues' research that I think we need to identify. One, convergence between different fields. Well, I have done something about pharmaceuticals, and you may hear something about energy, and you may hear something about ICT. I think this is one of these issues that there is a common challenge. It's not only sector-specific, it's far greater. And in many cases, when you try to convey a message between different industries, that there is some kind of a tendency to everybody focus on their own thing. So one message and key message that I would like to come out of this, at least meeting, is that this is a far bigger issue than just a sector-specific. The other thing is that, at least for me in terms conceptually, I don't think that localization per se is bad. Every country, and I'll try to address it in a minute, try to have more companies localize their activities in their jurisdiction. Even in the US, different states compete for whatever manufacturing, whatever research activity. The question is the road to get there. So it's not the actual objective. In my view, localization is not good or bad, it's the way that you get to that. And I think that's what we've tried to do in a recent paper that looked at the reasons, the underlying conditions for localization policies in the pharmaceutical sector, but to some extent also provide a more conceptual analysis about localization by and large. I think that when we try to look at localization, try to understand it first from the government's perspective, from the countries that try to apply it. Localization, to some extent, in their eyes, is a rational decision, because in their eyes it may secure national sovereignty, self-sufficiency, job security, economic growth, climbing up the innovation ladder, and to compete and to become a global exporter. These are objectives that we constantly see by any other economy and any type of policy. In the different countries that I visited, be it Malaysia, be it Indonesia, be it Brazil, be it India, be it Russia, all policymakers to some extent express these objectives as the intended outcome of using localization policies. In the biopharma sector, we have a more, if you like, diverse set of policies, because the biopharma sector, as I'm sure you all know, is consisted of a much more, I would say, complex ecosystem compared to other elements, because you have 15 years of research, development, launch of product, loss of exclusivity, compete over prices and market entry, generic competition, and then products usually do not become obsolete after 2 or 3 years, like the technology pace, in which you have to innovate every 2 years or every 3 years. But the medicines can take place and can still be effective for a dozen, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, even if you take aspirin or whatever. So we certainly have a lot of silos to which or in which government can apply type of localization policies, from the clinical research to the research and development, to the manufacturing elements, to the IP, of course, and also to conditioning market access entry with so-called localization policies. In our paper, we have tried to, in that case, to dumb down, if you like, the discussion and to offer 2 perspectives about localization. Both can try to secure localization. In our view, one would be successful and one would not. The first one is an incentive-based or market-based or market incentives that would allow companies to voluntarily and willingly come to a country and to operate more, let's say, aggressively or expand their activities in a given market. Now, the manner in which companies would choose to come to a different market will depend on a variety of issues which we describe in the paper, but I would say the following. Companies are to some extent, multinationals are country neutral, but they are policy biased. So in their perspective, it doesn't really matter overall which country they would choose to operate, as long as the conditions are there. Having said that, some countries, because of geographical indications, because of market size, have a better potential to do some things rather than others. For example, if all countries aim for manufacturing, say in pharmaceutical, it's unlikely that all of them will get a piece of manufacturing. Eventually, pharma business will focus on manufacturing in selected few sites. However, the research and development, which is consisted of about $150 billion, that can spread out to many countries. And to some extent, the value that is being generated is far greater than the manufacturing element. Not to mention the launch of products, the investment in education, and the other externalities that come from them. So if you provide a supportive ecosystem of both infrastructure That's, let's say, government investment, but also incentives in the regulatory side, in the market access side, good IP protection. Then, as we will see and as I will try to explain later on, we will witness greater outcomes and greater positive results. On the other hand, we see countries that have a more mandatory localized approach to their activities. Usually this, in the pharmaceutical sector, be based on some kind of conditions, a priori conditions for the registration of the product, say localized clinical trials, or obligation to collaborate with a local, so-called local company, the compulsory transfer of know-how, knowledge, and IP, competing for tenders or for market entry would be conditioned by collaboration or even complete, I would say, surrender of product to a local vendor. So these localization policies are being applied across the pharma ecosystem in order, in the eyes of these governments, to allow for greater localized activities. What we have done in the paper, and what I think the paper is available online, we've tried to classify the degree of severity of different localization policies in terms of how mandatory they are compared to, let's say, the market entry size with different countries. So if we look, for example, at procurement, we have identified that some of the BRICS countries and APEC countries have the more challenging localization or compulsory localization environments. What we see here is that, for example, in pharma sector, usually procurement is based on two silos. One is that when the drug is with exclusivity, under exclusivity, and the other is that the drug loses its exclusivity. These are, let's say, the two dimensions. If we refer here, for example, in a case in which there is already some kind of a upcoming generic entry to the market, we can see that some countries are applying a very aggressive localization policy with regards to procurement. For example, you must manufacture locally, or you must transfer your know-how or knowledge to some extent to a local company that would manufacture the generic for you, quote unquote. But initially, I've sort of made a statement that compulsory localization measures will provide negative outcomes. How do I know that? I mean, why should companies and countries care about bad localization? We cannot just say that something is bad. We have to measure its outcomes. So, again, this is just highlights from the paper, but here are a few slides which are empirical evidence. This is what we do usually. We try to measure the policies with the outputs that they generate. If you look at countries that have the most market-based or compulsory-based localization policies, with a perception of how competitive these countries are for investment, and what we've done, we've correlated the degree of severity of localization policy. So on the one hand, we've constructed, I'm going to be a geek for 1 second. I'm geek all the time, but I'm going to be a geek for 1 second. We've constructed a, let's say, localization variable on the one hand, and we've compared it with something that we are issuing every year, which is called the BCI survey, which looks at the executives' opinions about competitiveness and readiness of different countries, and we've correlated them, and we see that countries that are considered the most competitive and have evidence to that effect also have the most market-friendly or market-based incentives for localization, while countries that have the most severe localization policies are also being perceived as the least competitive, and it's not only about localization. They are being considered least competitive across the board. Here is another output again from the pharma sector. What we have done here is we've compared localization policies and severity to number of clinical trials or clinical trials intensity in different countries. 60% to 65% of clinical research in the pharma industry is invested in clinical trials. So out of the $150 billion, approximately 65% goes into clinical trials. Not to mention that clinical trials are the gateway for so many other things, such as multi-center research, physicians being at the cutting edge of any type of collaborative research, and especially patients that are able to get the most cutting-edge treatment at a very early stage. If we look at numbers of clinical trials in countries that have friendly localization policies or market access, market-based localization policies, compared to countries such as Indonesia that have a very unfriendly localization policies and compulsory, we see that the difference is staggering. And another thing that you see here is that size doesn't matter, in the sense that you can be a very big market and still the rewards from your localization policy to research in clinical trials will be very small. Because if you force companies to do post-marketing phase studies or preconditional clinical phases in order to do registration, they'll probably focus only on that. Last slide. We've also looked at localization severity compared to other types of outputs, such as triadic patenting, which is, let's say, the more innovative type of patenting, looking at EPO, USPTO, and JPO statistics, looking at strengths and weaknesses of clinical trials, looking at R&D investment, and with the size of pharmaceutical experts. And again, we see that countries with severe localization policies tend to have lower outputs over time. And we've measured that, by the way, over a time series of 15 years. So I think that the conclusion here is that the fact that you want to have localization, that's in itself a noble objective. If you want to get there, you make to want companies to come to your country voluntarily rather than force them, because otherwise you will not achieve the outcome that you wish to achieve.
Should I just jump in there? Unfortunately, I don't have any Godfather quotes prepared for this presentation.
You can use Pulp Fiction. They're also great.
Sort of sandwich between the Godfather quotes and the cool tech guy.
I love you, honey bun.
I'm going to talk a little bit about local content requirements in renewable energy sectors, and I want to make 2 points sort of in this brief presentation. And the first is that there's a lot of temptations for governments to use localization requirements in renewables simply because of the nature of subsidization and sort of industrial development. And the second is that these sort of requirements reflect a complete misunderstanding of how innovation actually happens in these industries. And so I'll talk very briefly about why everyone's tempted to use them, then I'll talk about how everyone is using them, and then I'll talk a few minutes about Germany as a case that has sort of used a very active industrial policies to help local firms participate in global supply chains without resorting to these kinds of local content requirements that are so prevalent. Can we
Back.
Yeah, it's an acquired skill, as I learned.
All right.
So, renewable energy is a rapidly growing industry, and there's a temptation for everyone to get sort of slice of the pie. And for developing countries, it's a attempt to kind of leapfrog up the value chain. For advanced economies, it's sort of the temptation to create local manufacturing jobs in these new sectors. But as investment has increased very rapidly in these global industries, public subsidies have also increased very rapidly. A lot of renewable energy technologies are only competitive, as you all know, as a result of sort of subsidy programs, feed-in tariffs, and so on. And governments around the world have often tied these kinds of subsidy programs to local content requirements in an attempt to sort of justify public spending, create kind of political support for these policies domestically. And so the rise of local content requirements is sort of proportional to the rise of public investment in these industries in many ways. And so they're used both in developing and in advanced economies. This is not sort of a global south situation. They often lead to trade conflicts, so they're local content requirements are often countered with all sorts of anti-dumping duties, and so this is kind of a tit-for-tat game and part of broader mercantilist tendencies in these industries. And as I said, they're most often directly tied to subsidy programs for wind and solar technology. So let me just give you a few examples of how this has played out. So China is often held up as the classic violator in these conflicts, and it was one of the first ones to use local content requirements as part of subsidy programs for the wind industry starting in 2003. The industry localized very quickly. China then in 2007 stopped this particular program. In 2009, it got rid of the local content requirements. There was a second US complaint from the steelworkers about a separate subsidy program in 2010. There were kind of bilateral consultations in China, got rid of those particular requirements. There are all sorts of, as you probably will talk about, all sorts of informal requirements that continue to apply. But so China was sort of the first case here. It's unclear, in my opinion, whether the kind of localization of the industry really had anything to do with the local content requirements in the wind industry, in part because a lot of these parts are so heavy to ship, the domestic market was so large, so there were all sorts of commercial incentives to localize manufacturing. So I think it's very hard to disentangle how effective they actually were. The second case that sort of often comes up in renewable energy, can you just advance one, is Ontario. So, rich country, not in the global south. Ontario introduced a feed-in tariff in 2009 that required 50% domestic content for wind and 60% for solar. Japan very quickly initiated consultations over this. The EU and the US joined these consultations. The WTO ruled, Ontario appealed. In 2012, they sort of finally lost this case, and it took them another 2 years until 2014 to actually get rid of the localization requirements, which is sort of interesting because you can get away with it for quite a long time, even if it's very clearly illegal, and then it takes a lot longer for you to actually sort of adjust. The most recent case that has made headways is India. Wow, this is really... I feel like the minute I became faculty, I started having these sort of technical issues all over the place, just like the professors I'd watched for years doing the same thing. But so India in 2013 launched a very big solar initiative domestically, which also was required local manufacturing. The US, in this case, launched a case. By 2014, 10 other countries had joined this case. India, undeterred, launched the second phase of this program that maintained these local manufacturing requirements. The WTO subsequently ruled, India appealed, and just this week, 2 days ago, India finally lost the case. And then immediately turned around, and this is sort of where it gets interesting, and can we advance one more, and filed a case against the US, because it turns out there are 10 US states that also have local content requirements as part of their local subsidy programs. So you sort of see where this is going. This is sort of very easy to get lost in these negotiations. Everyone's doing it seems like. So let me talk a little bit about why I think these are counterproductive, in particular in these industries. In wind, as I said before, there are some commercial reasons to localize anyway. So there's sort of a question to how much these policies make a difference. But they're also counterproductive for jobs. Most of the jobs in wind and solar are in generation and maintenance. We've sort of created this public discussion about manufacturing. There's actually much more employment in other parts of the supply chain. And so it's unclear that there are huge job gains from shifting manufacturing, especially in the solar industry. There's nobody in these factories. Most of it is fully automated, right? They're counterproductive for consumers. They increase prices and they make it harder for these technologies to reach grid parity. I mean, they're subsidized in the first place because they're not competitive with fossil fuels. We require more subsidization if we make them more expensive, and they create fragmented global markets for products that have huge scale economies. And so there's sort of a question whether Ontario really needs its own manufacturing of these things. And then finally, in Ontario is another good case of this. Only the most automated sort of low-end parts of the value chain tend to localize as a result of these policies. And a lot of the Chinese firms that I was interviewing as part of my research when Ontario came up with the feed-in tariff said very clearly that the minute that these policies are gone, they're going to pull these robots and put them somewhere else. So it's sort of a question to what extent the stuff that's easily movable actually leads to any kind of sustainable industrial development in the places that it goes. And then finally, and I think this is what this table is about, it's counterproductive for innovation, which increasingly happens in collaboration of firms with very different capabilities in different parts of the world. And so for a lot of the key wind and solar technologies, American startups, German small and medium-sized firms, and Chinese manufacturers actually work together quite productively on bringing these technologies to market. And so forcing localization breaks up these global networks, and it's pretty disruptive for the flow of information and innovation in these networks. And so this is some of the kind of relationships that I've studied in my research, where technologies really come to market as a result of very different skills that are located in different firms. And so let me just finish by talking briefly about the German sort of experience as an example of how this can be done differently. There's all sorts of reasons we can debate German energy policy, which I think we should leave for a different day. But what Germany's done well is to support local firms to enter wind and solar industries in ways that sort of complements and doesn't necessarily compete with China. German renewable energy sectors are pretty large. They're sort of on track to rival the auto sector in terms of employment in Germany. But they're very specialized. 90% of firms are suppliers of components, sort of very specialized, customized components, and production equipment. And so these firms are not kind of relying on protected markets. They are highly integrated, and they're relying on globalization in many ways themselves. So they hold 50% of world market share for the products that they make. Almost half of their production goes to Asia. They have a huge trade surplus with China, and almost 90% of revenues are earned abroad. And these firms have benefited from industrial policies that have helped them enter and work in these global networks. That includes industry associations that have helped small firms find partners in China to work on these kinds of collaborative projects. Gearless wind turbines, for instance, new kinds of automation technologies. The first fully automated solar manufacturing lines were sort of developed as a result of these collaborations between German suppliers and Chinese customers, and a lot of interaction between them. I can talk about this for hours, so I should just probably move on. But they also relied on a lot of industrial policy sort of institutions that have helped small firms be quite nimble and participate. And so one of them is, can you just advance this one? One of them is a very old sort of system in Germany of funding collaborative research between different firms. The requirement for these R&D funds are 2 or 3 firms need to work together with the research institute. A lot of wind and solar firms have participated in this and have used these kinds of collaborations to enter the industry in the first place. The banking system in Germany is another case that has sort of supported this kind of long-term development of retooling production plans and doing R&D to enter these industries in the first place. A lot of the firms that I've interviewed were founded in the 18th century, 19th century. I mean, these are hundreds of years old and have sort of very different histories before they end up in wind and solar. And then finally, we have the sort of vocational training system that supplies manufacturing staff. And it's because of those institutions that these firms have done well and benefited in many ways from China's growth without using localization requirements or sort of trying to kind of keep others out. The reason why I'm saying this, if you can move one more, sorry, I'm really struggling with this thing. The reason why I bring this up is that when a German solar manufacturer that was struggling, the same one that initiated a lot of the trade cases against China and the US, spearheaded efforts to introduce anti-dumping duties in the European Union. The solar industry in Germany remained neutral on the case, but interestingly, the German industry associations were very heavily opposed, and even the metal workers union in Germany came out against the anti-dumping tariffs. And so they formed a coalition and lobbied Brussels and avoided these anti-dumping duties in the end. And so I'm sort of highlighting this as a more productive way of changing domestic preferences about trade through smart industrial policy that helps firms benefit from these new markets, but not in ways that sort of artificially move around sort of lower-end parts of the production. And so I guess maybe to summarize, I think it's completely understandable that governments want sort of a bang for their buck of investing public money into these new sectors. But I think we need to be smarter about finding ways of creating sustainable domestic industries that don't rely on these protectionist barriers. And I think Germany is an interesting case of how this can be done despite having the 3rd highest manufacturing wages in the OECD, and all sorts of other sort of regulatory issues that everyone always says should, diminish their manufacturing economy. So far, it doesn't happen. So thank you.
Thank you.
You will probably take me apart right away after I of this, right?
No problem. It's actually always good to hear a German saying positive things about trade these days, so don't have to worry about that. So I think I'm the transition between more of the academic side of the panel and apparently the cool end of the table. Happy to sort of fill a little bit of that role. As Nigel laid out, I work for the National Association of Manufacturers. You probably run into us in your travels about town, but we represent about 14,000 manufacturing companies, all of whom have a presence here in the United States, large and small. We're actually about 90% small and medium-sized enterprises, which gives us a little bit of a different perspective in terms of dealing with these issues. And I work on our trade team, so I spend a lot of time specifically, as Nigel laid out, dealing with and working with our companies to understand the policy environment that they face in global markets, what barriers they may face, and then working with them to try to understand what their options might be to be able to tackle these barriers. And localization barriers, localization policies, local content requirements certainly have been an important theme for us in working in a variety of markets. And as Nigel laid out, I think that we see a proliferation of these types of barriers, and really, I would say an evolution of these types of barriers, moving beyond sort of traditional, relatively straightforward local content requirements to having to think about the presence of policy pieces that provide de facto localization protection for companies in these markets, and create some of these types of challenges for U.S. companies trying to be able to operate successfully. And really, again, that trade piece is a critical component of reaching that 95% of customers and consumers that exist outside of our borders. That being said, I think Meyer and Jonas, and I'm sure David will as well, put a really good point on the perspective that I think we need to all take on this issue, and our companies need to take, which is localization in and of itself is not necessarily a negative thing. Certainly, it's a part of our own. Looking at U.S. manufacturing strategies, for example, we want to encourage the development and growth of a strong manufacturing sector here at home. That includes being able to provide the right type of policy environment for U.S. manufacturing companies, but also for foreign manufacturing companies that may look to invest, create jobs, and participate actively in the economy. So the very concept of localization is not necessarily problematic. It's really all about the tools that we're seeing pop up in many of these other markets to achieve that goal, that create those challenges, that create those de facto barriers that limit the opportunities for our companies to operate in this space. And that's why it's really critical for looking at potential localization barriers to really get past, to dig in detail. Many of the top level goals, promoting innovation, promoting economic development, are perfectly fine goals. But the devil really here is in the details. And as I mentioned, I think we see sort of a metastasis of many of these types of localization barriers, moving beyond sort of the straightforward ones into other types of barriers that, again, essentially serve de facto in that localization context. So, for example, you look at, let's say, a ban on remanufactured products into a particular market, which in and of itself isn't a local content requirement, doesn't necessarily fit exactly that classic mold, but you look at that policy alongside, for example, the presence of secondhand markets for some of these products in foreign markets, and it does serve then as that de facto localization barrier. Or you look at something like an investment cap or investment limitation, which exists in a variety of markets. In and of itself, that isn't necessarily purely about localization, tech transfer in that classic mold, but it does create the type of environment in which domestic companies that may seek to partner or domestic government entities have a greater ability to be able to negotiate for technology transfer or intellectual property transfer or transfer of other types of capital or know-how. And so, we try to look at this issue, I think, from this holistic perspective. From the manufacturing perspective specifically, we see that many of these localization policies are really very much tied to manufacturing, and in particular the high end of the manufacturing sector. The fact remains for, here in the US, Our manufacturing sector produces more now than it has at any point in the past. Our manufacturing sector remains, in terms of the quality of the output, the development of key advanced manufacturing, really the envy of the rest of the world. And that does drive a lot of efforts by many of these other markets to put in place policies to encourage the development of potentially competitive manufacturing sectors at home. At the end of the day, that shortcut, I think, as a good deal of research out there shows, is at best a shortcut. You're providing a short-term step to be able to encourage companies to be able to set up local manufacturing, but really bypassing the types of long-term environmental changes that you need to create to really foster a sustainable development path for, say, 3D printing in India or advanced pharmaceutical production in China. Really working then with many of our stakeholders to really try to get that message out there. So just to give you an example of some of the range of localization policies that we deal with and look at before I get into a couple of specific examples. We look at issues like discriminatory taxes on imported products into Colombia, looking at the alcohol and spirits sector. I mentioned investment caps, for example, that create an environment that allows more negotiating room for technology transfer. That's certainly something that pops up in markets like China. It also pops up in markets like Thailand and others. Bans on imported products, the remanufactured bans that we see in China and India. Industrial policies in a variety of sectors. So high-level development plans that encourage the growth and development of particular sectors and feed the ability to then follow up with more specific policies that create many of these particular localization barriers. So again, just some of that type of range. I want to talk just a little bit about 3 particular examples of localization policies that we track. And I picked these particular 3 both because of the breadth. I think it shows some of the momentum that we see in a number of key markets towards use of some of these specific localization barriers as a means to achieve those goals. And it also happens to highlight, I think, 3 of the hubs for localization policies that we see and regularly work with in the emerging sector, in the emerging world. In particular, it's Brazil, India, and China. And I'm more than happy in the Q&A to talk about any other localization barrier in another emerging market that you'd like to deal with. So the first thing I want to talk a little about is Brazil. And Brazil has in place a plan that they instituted in 2011 called the Plano Brasil Maior. So this is a high-level, central government-led policy designed to promote economic development with a number of very specific targets for industrial production, for research and development done in market, and for development of a number of key sectors. Again, high-level framework promoting local production, not necessarily problematic. The challenge with this policy, actually there's 2 main challenges. One, the policy itself included a number of very specific tax, tariff, and financing options that include some pretty clear and direct localization content. The other issue that's popped up in Brazil is it's really given momentum to a variety of other localization policies that are not themselves formally part of the plan, but sort of feed into a growing body of localization policies that we see in Brazil. And really, Brazil has been one of the leading releasers, the leading formulators of localization policies really for the last 6 or 7 years. So examples, some of the specific types of content that we're looking here, you see local content requirements, for example, for companies to be able to garner tax incentives for them to actually export product overseas. And for most industries, you're talking about there's a max of 40% content limit. For some industries, including pharmaceuticals, actually there's a little bit of a higher limit. There's a 65% limit. But very tangible, specific financial incentive for companies to be able to localize their content if they're looking to export that abroad. We also have seen the release shortly after that plan of a series of export financing initiatives that have specific local content requirements for a number of particular sectors. Automotive has been one that has really been solidly in the spotlight for Brazil. They had released some policies a couple of years ago requiring 65% local content. A lot of pushback, both at the bilateral level as well as the multilateral level. They updated the policy and removed the actual numerical cap, but they replaced it instead with a suite of more generalized policies that had the same type of localization intent. So that companies to qualify for this had to have a certain amount of it, had to have, a high level of local content, high level of localized research and development. They had to meet energy efficiency standards and some labeling. So a couple of non-directly localization related policies. But, the thrust remained clear, even though you were able to sort of deal with the specific percentage in play here. Since that's come out in 2011, we've seen a variety of other sort of copycat policies that deal with industries like machinery, that deal with fertilizers, that deal with the information technology industry, that deal with steel. And again, all sort of using this similar playbook. And it really, I think, illustrates one of the challenges in working on localization policies in these markets. You can play whack-a-mole and try to knock down each of these policies as they come up. You can deal it bilaterally, you can do it multilaterally. But when you have sort of the high-level impetus that really drives a lot of this work, in this case, sort of an organizing principle with this plan, it makes it that much more difficult, even for those who are really monitoring this issue very, very closely, to be able to learn of all of these policies, much less to be able to come up with a comprehensive strategy to be able to engage on these issues, responsibly. I think that's really where all of us need to think proactively about how to be able to foster a better message about how to be able to spur appropriately manufacturing in these types of markets. So that's the first example. Second example I want to talk about is China. And again, there are a number of different areas where this pops up. Certainly the investment approval infrastructure is one that traditionally has popped up, although China is in the process of revising some of its foreign investment rules that may deal a little bit with some of this particular milieu. But the other issue that's particular to the manufacturing sector that's popped up in the last 2 years is the release of a high-level plan called the Made in China 2025 initiative. So this was again, high-level framework released in 2015, same type of playbook you see in Brazil, actually, in terms of some general targets for localization of production. In this particular case, though, they actually also released a specific list of 10 priority sectors, and those 10 priority sectors would probably read a lot like 10 priority sectors that the U.S. government might lay out in terms of encouraging manufacturing in sort of advanced areas. So things like new energy vehicles, next generation IT equipment, advanced biopharmaceuticals, robotics. So all high value, high job creating sectors that many, many countries are looking to try to develop. That initial plan, though, had specific content thresholds and specific goals, both overall as well as goals that were then released for specific sectors. So for example, 40% in these particular sectors, 40% of the content consumed had to be domestic by 2020 and 70% by 2025. These are incredibly ambitious goals. Again, it's important to note the initial plan itself, short on details. They said it called for government policies and market mechanisms to be able to encourage localization of production, but it raised a lot of concern, partly because of past history here. So you look at the plan, and there's a lot of coded words that we've seen pop up in other policies that have a localization angle. So things like secure and controllable, which deals with the ICT context, or reliable, or indigenous, which brings back memories of some of China's push for indigenous innovation. So, I think this is part of the reason that folks are monitoring this very, very closely. The other reason is because of a very specific policy trajectory that we've seen over the last several years, and in particular with a policy called China's Strategic and Emerging Industries Policy, released in 2010. And you saw, again, some of the same potential timeline. High-level policy at the central level, release of a variety of policies at the provincial level, and then implementation of funding programs took place at the provincial, municipal, and local level in China. And what you saw was at the same time that China's Minister of Commerce, China's Premier, all of China's sort of top-level leadership was reassuring American audiences that these programs and policies are going to be fully open to American companies to be able to participate if they were invested in China. At the same point in time, conversations with many of those who were actually implementing the program gave a very, very different story. Indicated that whether or not on paper these were supposed to be open to Chinese and domestic companies, or Chinese and foreign companies, in reality, the impetus for this policy was to be able to promote domestic indigenous Chinese manufacturing. So, creates, I think, a number of challenges potentially for how the Made in China 2025 program is rolled out. I think for a lot of companies that are invested in China, they look at this potentially as some opportunity and some challenge. But again, the track record here, I think, gives us and many, many others a lot of pause for those who are invested in China. And for those of us who are watching the US manufacturing environment, realizing sort of the level of ambition that China has to be able to build its own manufacturing environment, that gives us a little bit of pause, but for some different types of reasons, and really, I think, spurs us to look closely at how we're considering manufacturing policy here in the US. Last example I want to talk about very briefly, because Jonas actually covered this in part already, is India. And there's two main localization angles that we look at here. One is the solar policy that I think Jonas laid out, and unfortunately some of the concerning tit for tat now that we're starting to see with WTO cases with them filing against state policies here. But the other is something called the preferential market access policy. This was initially launched in the IT sector in 2012. Again, some of the same types of toolkit, promoting the ICT sector, wanting to build up domestic infrastructure, wanting to build strong domestic manufacturers, and therefore providing specific local content requirements and preferences for Indian domestic manufacturers vis-a-vis their foreign counterparts. Very strong pushback on this, primarily bilaterally. India is sometimes a little more trouble than the WTO. At the end of the day, this is a successful example of where there was some ability to push back. It was limited first to just the ICC sector, and then it was limited just to government procurement for particular products. So for the majority of US ICT companies trying to operate in India, it didn't have an immediate impact. But we are beginning now to see a return of references to PMA in potential other areas, medical devices, for example, just in the last couple of months, has popped up as an increasing concern. And again, we're watching this space very closely because the incoming leadership has put a lot of emphasis on developing a manufacturing sector in India to parallel, some of their strengths on the services side. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That can create significant opportunity, certainly for us in terms of having good conversations with India about how to think about manufacturing. There's some positives there, but the trick is in the implementation and whether or not these types of high-level pushes get interpreted by varying pieces of the Indian bureaucracy and varying levels of the Indian government as a cover to be able to release much more localization specific content that really would be of significant concern for us. So the last, just sort of wrap this up, so the last piece that I want to sort of talk a little bit about, and I think it's probably will end up being a trend, we'll talk about this more in the Q&A, is thinking about how to be able to effectively message with foreign governments on localization issues. As we're seeing sort of this proliferation, it's very easy, I think, for us on the industry association side, us on the company side, and us on the government side to push back and say, okay, here's a policy that's popped up. We have to find a way of fighting this particular policy. You spend significant time and effort playing whack-a-mole with this particular policy, and then you got to deal with this one over here. And so you end up being very reactive in terms of the way that you deal with these issues, and you're sometimes using one mix of channels, sometimes using the full mix of channels, but in often cases, really being fairly limited in terms of the way you approach these issues. I think a long-term effective strategy has to be to engage on the ways to be able to promote economic development in key areas like manufacturing, but in a way that creates opportunities for companies, regardless of whether they're an American company or an Indian company or a Chinese company, but are really based on improvements to the fundamental business environment and a shift away from the approach of beggar thy neighbor and using some of these tools and is supposed to try and find new creative ways to create localization policies that don't necessarily fit the mold, thinking instead about ways to be able to improve the business environment to encourage companies to be able to invest in the manufacturing sector, the biopharmaceutical sector, the ICT sector, the renewable energy sector, in ways that are sustainable and create a longer-term anchor for those types of industries in these markets. And that's true regardless of whether in the developed world or the developing world. But I think it's a message that's a little bit more challenging to be able to bring to bear, especially when you have an American nameplate on, to be honest with you, going and having those discussions with China and Indian places. So I think I'll probably talk about that a little bit more in discussion with that. Let me turn it over finally to the cool end of the table.
Thanks, Nigel and Ryan. You know, if you're going to build me up as the cool end of the table, you could at least give me walk-on music or something. For what in some ways is a dry topic, but an important topic, and I think something that when you translate it to the real world is actually interesting and pretty tangible. I'm actually glad I went last because a lot of the issues that you all talked about, we've seen traditionally in the ICT and kind of the tech sector, and the same kinds of localization requirements in the hardware space, including in the services space as well, and that's still an issue. I think what's different over the past probably 5 years or so is an application of the same kinds of strategies by governments and impulses by governments to the area of data and information. And sometimes for similar reasons, for industrial policy reasons, others sometimes for reasons that are pretty unique to information and to the internet. And I want to break those down a little bit. It's worth pausing, though, just for a second to think about how the internet has changed trade, how data has changed trade, to kind of set the scene a bit for why this is important, and then how data localization requirements are inconsistent with that and posing a challenge to that. And then I'll round up at the end talking about why I don't think some of those objectives really are met. In fact, are hurt by some of these strategies. So the first thing I want to talk about is what the internet has done for trade. It was not that long ago, right, that if you were a new business, any business, an entrepreneur, and you wanted to reach global markets, right, you needed to have quite a lot of capital, you needed scale, you needed global distribution chains in some way or another. And that's fundamentally changed in about 10 years or so. And that's because of three things. That's because of networks and interconnection. That's because of the ability to access information over those networks. And that's because of access to massive computing power. And all of those things, all three of those things, used to be kind of the prerogative of a very few. And so, you can, through your phone or through your laptop, get access to the same kind of computing power that IBM is using and others are using. You have the same information on your phone that President Obama has on his phone, with the vast federal government resources behind him, more or less, especially with WikiLeaks. But that stuff to aside, and this is a big deal in terms of social change. We get that. It's a big deal in terms of trade. And the internet is often called like kind of this amazing leveler, the great equalizer. And I think there's some real truth to that in trade. And I think what's interesting about localization is often for good reasons, you see governments and developing country governments saying, we want a piece of this action too. We want more internet. And so we're going to do it by requiring you to kind of build data centers locally, and that's how we're going to build our sector. And it really is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, there's still a big digital divide and a lot of other things that have to happen for the benefits of the internet to be shared widely, but those opportunities for participation are so vastly different than they were 15 years ago in the international trade system. I just want to put a couple of numbers behind this. A couple of stats. This is a chart that McKinsey put out maybe a year ago in a report they did on global data flows, and just looked at how much the flow of data globally has changed over the past decade or so. 45x increase. And what's also interesting about this chart is just how much more multipolar it was than 10 years ago. Also, kind of in if you're looking at the number impact, McKinsey found that the contribution to global GDP growth over the past several years of data flows actually exceeds that of manufactured goods. Now that's a little bit of a weird statistic because so much of manufacturing now does have a services component and a data component, and it's a little bit of a false distinction, but it also points to the fact that there is so much servicification of trade and so much of the value of goods that are being shipped are wrapped up in the data that's associated with it. So you cut off data flows in some way or another, and you're losing a lot of that value. I'm going to show a quick video here. Yeah.
Today, more people, organizations, and governments around the world depend on the flow of data. Connected to the internet by mobile devices, satellites, and computers, we create and use huge amounts of data every day. Whenever we check the weather, pay for lunch, send a message, book a flight, or simply look up the fastest route to the grocery store, we rely on a steady flow of data. Businesses of all sizes, including small businesses and startups, use data to make their global operations more efficient, bring products to new markets, and quickly satisfy customer demand. Doctors and hospitals utilize data to diagnose and treat patients faster and more effectively. And governments use data to more effectively manage traffic flows and utilities by providing real-time information so that officials can help alleviate congestion and improve efficiency. Every day, data helps drive smarter, quicker, and better decisions. But what is data? Data is simply information, like sales histories, satellite imagery, crop yields, traffic density, search results, and machine performance. When processed, analyzed, and transmitted by computers, data flows throughout the internet, crossing continents almost instantaneously. And the speed at which data travels is dependent on its ability to alter course, to travel the shortest available route. Just as you might adjust your route to work to avoid construction, data seeks out the fastest, most secure path to its destination, even if that means traveling through other countries. Our ability to quickly exchange information across huge distances is the underpinning of our global economy. These global data flows enable digital trade, connecting people and economies, and helping to speed the movement of ideas and capital that drive innovation. We all benefit from data that moves freely around the world. For example, close monitoring and analysis of weather data helped one global retailer reduce food waste by $9.4 million in 1 year. Airlines continuously assess global weather conditions and adjust flight schedules, saving travelers time and money, and increasing the safety and efficiency of air travel. And with ready access to online customers and low-cost services, entrepreneurs and startups can go global before they even go national. Every day, people, business, governments, and organizations are empowered by the efficient and secure movement of data around the globe. The open flow of data is an essential element driving growth in the global economy and a critical resource for ensuring the future prosperity of the communities where we live.
So that's a little video that ITI, the sister group of ITIF, put together, and sure, it's a little corporate-y and data proselytizing, but I think it kind of captures the, sorry Cody, it captures the picture pretty well of just the different kind of economic and trade value of data and how computing platforms work today. So we don't have much time, so I just want to spend maybe 3 more minutes so we have time for some discussion. And talk about what we're seeing, what we call kind of data localization. And these are mandates by governments to actually store data locally in a way, as I said, to kind of replicate the traditional tools of forced localization, import substitution, and bring them into the world of the internet. And you see governments either saying, keep all data of nationals of this country in this country exclusively, you can't transfer it out, or mirror it, keep copies of the data in the country. It comes in various different forms. And I think there are kind of 2 core iterations to this. One is sort of an economic development strategy, and one is achieving legit other kind of public policy objectives. And let me just talk briefly about each. On the second, on the security, on sort of the public policy objectives, we see security and privacy as the two biggest rationales that are used. And the security notion comes a little bit from almost a common sense feeling that, like, if people are concerned, and I think fairly concerned about, there's all this data, and you saw kind of a positive story of data here, but you say, data can be misused. There's privacy issues. There's law enforcement kinds of issues. Who gets data? Is my data secure, and so forth? And that's understandable, and governments need to deal with that. But the leap that is made by governments sometimes is, okay, we're concerned about that, and the way to keep it safe is to keep it here, right? Keep it with me. It's good. You can't touch it. When you start to dig a little bit, it doesn't really hold up, and in fact, is pretty counterproductive to those objectives. So the way that a lot of internet computing works is really a distributed model, and the value of it, both from a security and kind of a computing power point of view, is that you have data centers and machines all operating together. From a security point of view, you distribute data. And so many companies do something called data sharding, which is you're basically taking a data set and splitting it up, and then you're encrypting it. It's not all in one place. If you say keep all your data in my particular country, that becomes much more difficult. Similarly, from kind of a cybersecurity point of view, right? You're telling everyone, you want, I'm not going to name a country, country X's citizens' data, come here, it's a honeypot. It's also therefore vulnerable to kind of system failure. A couple of years ago, there was an issue with Samsung. Samsung's particular data center in Korea failed. Smart TVs in the US all went down, right? I don't think that's how Samsung configures things now, but they had at one point for at least one of their products. So it's like, you may all remember before you use, hopefully you all use Google Docs or whatever, Azure or Microsoft product, whatever it may be. You remember before, gosh, like this I've got this file on this disk on my hard drive. I'm going to go home and work on it there. I better email it there. Oh, I hope it doesn't crash. You don't need to worry about that in kind of a true cloud environment. You're kind of taking that away, and you're also exposing data to risk. And then the last point I'll make is just on sort of the economic development point of view. And I think here the story is a bit similar to other forced localization stories, but I guess a bit different too, in that the value of data is what is done with it. It is not the data center, which entails a lot of initial upfront investment, but there aren't like hundreds of people working at any particular data center. It's all of the things that happen on top of it and enable it. So as a path to kind of development of a cloud sector, it's not having the data center sitting there. Silicon Valley didn't become Silicon Valley because there's like 20 data centers sitting there and everyone's working at the data centers. So I'll leave it there. I know we just have about 15 minutes, so I want to make sure we have time for conversation. Thanks, John.
So, I will take the moderator's prerogative to pose the first question, but then I'm happy to open it up to the floor. I thought that was a really interesting sort of cross-section, sectoral sort of analysis of the issue and how it applies, and some similar, but then also some different ways. And so the first question I just wanted to pose to each of the people on the panel, now that we've spoken about the issue and we've sort of differentiated between that there are positive ways that countries can enact policies to help achieve the end objective, but that what we're seeing is a reversion to these sort of discriminatory, sort of distortionary policies. I suppose which leads to the question: so what should the US and other governments that sort of interested in sort of ensuring a rules-based, non-discriminatory sort of global trading system, and the firms and international institutions do to push back against these types of bad localization policies? Where should the focus be? Or should there be a particular angle of focus, whether it's bilateral or regional or multilateral? Do any of the, do you see any of the particular trade agreements, whether it's the Trade and Services Agreement or the Environmental Goods Agreement, or even like the US-China bilateral investment treaty? Is there a particular vehicle that you see as providing promise for sort of improving the current sort of framework of rules around localization? Yeah.
Simple question, right? You have 3 days, then we can. What you see over time is that if we look at the, if you like, the empirical test of what happens in localization in several countries, as we mentioned here, so-called forced localization is only growing, it's not decreasing. So clearly something that has been made so far is not working. I don't think that necessarily there is only one silver bullet. I think I want to come back to what I originally said. First of all, while each sector has its own issues, we've done some work also, as you mentioned, on ICT, and for example, on the fact that you sometimes require to have their own farms in a specific country, which is ridiculous. If you don't solidify and streamline the efforts to define it as a trade policy issue, a real issue for everyone, then you somehow sort of like lose impact or lose power. So the first thing I would, if I were a US official or government official, I would define it as a trade barrier in its own issue affecting all fields and start to convey that message. For industry, and I think that that's what the industries are starting to do now, and at least we've been fortunate to be a part of the industry effort, is also to push on the advocacy side and the education side, because at the end of the day, if governments themselves will not understand that it is against their own interest to go with this localization, they will not move. So you have two levels. One is to really define deductively, this is a concept of trade barrier which is far bigger than the sum of its parts. And secondly, to really push towards education, knowledge sharing, information, conceptually building the subject into the so-called constituents of that element in the different countries.
So I'm quite pessimistic about the ability to sort of use global treaties to change anything. I mean, it's already sort of from the renewable energy perspective, a lot of the stuff is already illegal. There's very little consequence to trying it out. It takes a long time to get through. And so I don't think at that level, tweaking the treaties or having new treaties is really going to get us very far unless we sort of figure out a way to reconfigure domestic interests. And I think you may have a different view on this, but I think the US is sort of a problematic case in this as well. I mean, we've done very little. If you interview these German firms who their competitors were 30 years ago, they had 50 competitors in the US, and today they have one. And so a lot of these small machine tools firms have gone bust over time, and I think we've neglected big parts of the manufacturing sector, even if there are other parts that are doing very well. And so that then plays out in these mercantilist sort of structures where we're trying to keep China out, but we've done very little to sort of be productive here about a lot of these things. And so I think my sort of approach would be to focus really on domestic industrial policy in a positive way to create the infrastructure so that firms can do well. And so I think that'll fix a lot of the interests at the global level.
We just jump in here. I mean, this is obviously something we spend a lot of time working on. At the NAM, we have a policy document called Competing to Win. It specifically lays out recommendations for our own government to take in a variety of areas to be able to strengthen the manufacturing economy and really strengthen the manufacturing economy in key ways. So I do agree with you that I think part of this has to be some of these domestic conversations about how to be able to incentivize the growth in these key sectors that then also sets an example for other countries in terms of how they should be having this conversation. I may be a little less pessimistic than you on the trade front, only in that I think that while I agree that many of the current approaches to be able to tackle these issues have not been effective at stemming the tide, I do also think there are things that we could do within that system to be able to, and really to come back to something that Meyer laid out as well, to lay this out clearly as a concept and how we need to look at localization policies outside of the traditional buckets of what has counted as localization. I think some of those traditional buckets are, very clearly, violative of WTO rules. But we're seeing many of these markets get increasingly creative in terms of how they look to develop these industries in ways that really have, are in effect have a localization impact even if they don't meet those buckets. So I do think that there's an important dialogue that has to take place at that bilateral and multilateral level on how to be able to effectively push back using all of the tools available. And those include the formal tools, but I think that also is a good deal of space that can be filled with governments to work more effectively together to be able to coordinate their discussions on localization policies when dealing with some of these common challenges. I mean, you talked, I think, effectively about how Germany has approached many of these issues, and there's some tools to be shared there. But, for US companies and German companies and French companies and Japanese companies looking at localization policies in a place like India, there's some common challenges there. And so, more effectively spurring the thinking of these as localization policies and a challenge that has to be effectively met, I think is also a bit, unfortunately, more of a blank space than it should be.
Yes, I guess I'd highlight three things. One is really recognizing, and I'm going to talk now more really about kind of the data and digital issues, is really recognizing that these are core trade issues of legitimate trade impact and concern. And I think what you have today is you have started to see that, and certainly like if you look in the TPP context, other contexts, you see organizations like NAM, the Ag Guys, others, all engaging on this issue, which just kind of underscores that this is really a cross-cutting issue. So you're starting to elevate it as a trade issue. I think where you still have a gap is you have the trade conversation and then you have the privacy and cybersecurity conversation. And too often those latter issues are viewed as almost red cards or get out of jail free cards. And I think this is kind of a classic trade problem where you have rules about non-discrimination and market access, and that's basically what we're talking about here. And you have public policy objectives, and there are core rules that we've lived with for 70 years in the WTO and GATT system of you shouldn't be hurting government's ability to pursue those objectives, but they need to do it in a way that's least trade restrictive and necessary, and there are long developed principles on it. So that needs to be applied to this space as well. One, the core principle, but then two, really thinking through what are less trade restrictive ways to achieve your objectives on privacy and security. And there are two other things, but I'll leave it at that.
I completely agree on that last point, and I think it goes back to the point you make in terms of the misguided understanding that geography defines cybersecurity, the protections that data, just because it's crosses borders, is more secure, or is insecure, and that data stored at home is better off. And the challenge that poses from a trade perspective, when you look at the impact that has from a trade perspective in terms of acting as a market access or as a market barrier. So with that, I wanted to open it up to questions. We have Emily in the back of the microphone. I just ask if you could just say your name and your affiliation.
Hello, Rachel Pfeffer from Library of Congress. I actually just wanted to build on those last points that David and Nigel made. Given that you talked about applying these long-standing principles to the realm of data, do you think I know there's been discussion from the WTO of potentially a new e-commerce or some sort of a new agreement or moving that, like somehow amending or incorporating data into the existing GATS or, amending trips or something, could that address some of these barriers? And what do you see as maybe the best way forward and the most likely to succeed?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's sort of a two-part approach. There are actually quite a number of existing rules that are out there now that are relevant to this debate, and that rules that aren't always kind of applied that comprehensively. And so I think one piece is just recognizing that some of the issues we're talking about are not actually new, and it's just applying these principles and agreements that governments have already made to new contexts. So there is some element of that and thinking about sort of how do we use our current tools better. The second, though, is there are some real gaps in current rules, given the weird way that the GATS was negotiated, that is kind of a sector by sector positive list basis, and some other peculiarities of GATS where new rules will be really relevant. And then there are other issues beyond sort of the movement of data, but other issues that are kind of important prerequisites for the digital economy to work in a trade setting, which haven't been well addressed by prior rules. So I think there's plenty of room in places like the WTO, in Trade and Services Agreement, and so on to address those gaps. So I think it's kind of a two-part, but it does come back to kind of a top overarching strategy issue of making these kind of digital trade issues something that we think of as kind of a core trade policy priority that requires resources and real strategy around, which I don't think we've kind of moved in that direction, but I think there's still more room to go.
No, I'd agree. I mean, I think TPP takes a number of steps in the right direction in updating the rules as they stand from GATS and the WTO, but there's still a host of unanswered questions about ensuring that they apply sort of evenly across all the different sectors and about testing those rules in a way and that provides greater clarity about applying existing rules and long-held concepts of trade to this new context. There's certainly still a long way to go, and TISA's e-commerce chapter is a chance to try and set an even higher benchmark and sort of achieve greater clarity around data flow rules above and beyond TPP. But that's not straightforward. And then going to the next level at the multilateral level, the WTO is a more challenging aspect to address the issues. But we're making steps in the right direction, but I think there's still a long way to go. We might take one more here, Emily.
Hi, Scott Thompson from Samsung. One aspect of localization in terms of political popularity that we haven't talked about is restricting even which locals can do the localizing. If you go down that road in the guise of fostering small and medium-sized enterprises in certain markets across certain sectors, it's politically popular to say, hey, we're just trying to foster startups here. You guys like startups. You don't want to restrict startups, do you? In a newfound infant industry argument of sorts. And in the South Korean context, Samsung can certainly attest that the small guys can take advantage of that in certain circumstances. So protecting smaller domestic competitors from larger domestic competitors and international competitors of various sizes. I want to hear across sectors how you find that SME protectionism applies here and what one can do to combat it.
Usually what you see in different markets, those are visited, which may be big, such as Malaysia or Russia, okay, or smaller, is that while there is a popularity to say localization will help local companies, usually localization is aimed at some specific stakeholders. And naturally this is also linked to gray economy, shall we call it like that. And it's not a secret that sometimes the beneficiaries of localization policies are very specific, let's say politically linked company's organization. The problem in terms of the evidence, because Samsung is not American. Samsung generated from somewhere, right? In terms of a company. The thing about a smaller company, an SME, etc., in these markets, even if you look at the big markets like Russia or Malaysia, etc., is that in many cases they lack the other infrastructure in order to grow into a bigger company. I mean, if from the pharma sector you are a small company but you don't have anyone to license the technology to, the big markets, you don't have the infrastructure, the regulatory capacity, etc., then you will not be able to grow into a big company. I also think that while maybe in ICT there may be better options in terms of, again, because you don't need to invest so much and essentially you can commercialize an app. But from what we saw, when you have restrictions of sort, encryption, sort of like obligations for encryption, disclosure, etc., what you usually see is that the level of startups and maturity in these markets is far lower than what you would expect from other developed or say open markets. But you might want to address it also.
I'm not sure which you pointed to here. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we look at this question in the same way that we're sort of having our broader discussion here, that we want to make sure that policies designed to promote local economic development, to be able to boost, to boost the ability of companies to operate effectively in these markets, are well structured to actually be effective, not just one-off shops that might boost one particular small group of stakeholders or one particular small group of companies. So I think what Mayor laid out in terms of looking at these things together, looking at sort of a suite of policies that would be effective in promoting that type of economic development, whether you're a large company or small company, should be the filter that you use.
With that, I think we've come to the end. Please join with me in thanking the panelists for helping